You're listening to Secret Sonics, a podcast exploring the creative side of music production. Hello and welcome to Secret Sonics. I am your host, Ben Wallach. Thank you so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be a little bit different than usual because it's just me. This is my first ever Solocast. And I thought I would talk about a few things. But before I dig into that, I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to everybody who's spent the time listening to this podcast, shared it with a friend, given me feedback, which has been a lot of you. I really appreciate it. If you haven't yet, if you could go to Apple Podcasts and give us a rating and review, that would be amazing. Hopefully 5 stars. That really will help the podcast move forward and get bigger and better and reach a larger audience, which is really my goal at this point, is to reach a really large audience. So if, in addition to rating and reviewing it, if you could share it with a friend or friends that you think will find it helpful, that would be amazing. So thank you so much in advance for that. First of all, I wanted to talk about how I conduct my interviews, why I'm asking questions I'm asking, and I think some people might be interested in my signal path, and I'll talk about that as well. So I guess let's just dig into that. So basically, I'm kind of using my own curiosity as a way of examining how other people produce music, because I'm interested in getting into their heads and seeing what their process is to hopefully improve my process and the listener of this podcast's process, because it's not just about the techniques. It's about what's your mindset? What are you thinking about? What are you going through when you're trying to get a sound? Like what is in your head? And I think if you have the right mindset, you could really improve so much faster in your production, not just learning new tips and tricks and things like that, really like being intentional with your decisions as a music producer. So the questions I ask are really geared towards that. And I've asked a bunch of questions and I've gotten a lot of different answers to very similar questions. And I've gotten feedback that my questions are even I'm playing too much by the script. And so I'm trying to, at this point, I think I've gotten better at it, of kind of just engaging in the conversation and seeing where it goes in addition to following the script. But the script is there on purpose because I do want to, at the end of the day, examine the creative process of everybody I'm speaking with. And I think for the most part, I've done a pretty good job at that. So in terms of my signal path, in terms of how I'm actually putting this podcast together, I am a big believer in dynamic microphones for voiceover and podcast work because they keep the room out of the equation. I mean, obviously, I have a sound-treated room, and that's part of why my voice sounds good on this podcast. But using the right microphone, I think, is a big part of it as well. And I happen to be talking into an Electro Voice RE20, which is one of my favorite microphones because it's so versatile and it has no proximity effect. And it's a dynamic mic, so the room is really much less of an issue. Extraneous noises are much less of an issue. And I think it just sounds great and very neutral, and it's easy to add EQ and compression to it without too many artifacts. And so I'm using an RE20, and I ask most of my guests to also use the dynamic microphone, whatever they have, if it's an SM7B or even if it's just an SM57. Dynamic microphones just work so much better for this type of interviews. Not everybody's had one, and so we've had some condensers on the podcast, but for the most part, I'm asking people to record on dynamic on their end, and then they send me the file, and then I sync it up. And what usually happens after the podcast is recorded is I'll kind of just do some basic EQ to take out low end, maybe some low mids. After that, I will compress it with a transparent compressor. I'm using the Slate VCA compressor, the red, I think it's FG401, which I just think is very transparent and musical sounding. After that, I'll use the gate on the Slate channel strip to kind of take out when I'm not talking or the guest isn't talking by maybe like 8 dB or so, just to get a little less noise in there. After that, a little de-essing and maybe boosting some high end. Well, actually, I almost always boost some high end to make it more legible. After that, the whole conversation goes into a limiter, which kind of keeps everything in check. And then everything, including the intros and the outros, is going through a maximizer, the ozone maximizer, at a limited output of -1. And that's it. That's the whole story. Keeping it pretty clean. So as I mentioned, I asked very similar questions to most guests, and obviously I get varied responses to everything. But I wanted to touch on a couple questions that I thought were surprisingly unanimous in the answers they received, and one question in particular that had the most extreme opposite ends of the spectrum answers to it. So basically everybody answered the question, like, what do you do if you're feeling uninspired and you need a boost? Everybody said, take a break. And I think that's a lesson to take home, is that if you're in the studio right now and things aren't going so great, maybe what you got to do is just step outside for the rest of the day, a couple days even, and just take a break, get your head out of that. It's an obsessive industry. And when we're in the studio, we kind of are just nonstop. And sometimes you just need to let your mind take a break. And sometimes that's the best way to get out of a headspace pickle, so to speak. The other question I wanted to touch upon was the question of templates. And pretty much everyone gave me a hell yes or a hell no about templates. Guests that come to mind that said hell no were Hillel Reiner and Ori Winokur. And they're just like, how could you be creative if you're using a template? Whereas a lot of other people said, yes, it saves me so much time. I have templates. Or even I think Dan Muffson said, templates are my new OCD. So it's so interesting for me to hear the spectrum of what people are talking about in terms of templates. And I thought I would kind of pitch in on this question and kind of give my 10 cents or penny, or I don't even know how much, about this topic. In the sense that I've also learned a lot from just conducting these interviews and talking with people that are doing this every day. So personally, I do have a lot of templates, but I've kind of changed my outlook on templates because of this podcast. So I have a mixing template, which is very much about signal routing and a few go-to, reverbs and delays like effects processing, not so much about individual track processing. So that's kind of how it's always been. And I think I will continue to go along this path of having a mixed template because it really does save me time, and I don't think it affects the tonality of the mix in that sense. And I think I will also continue using templates for music production. But the thing is, I think that I'm going to be less tied to what's in the template, meaning I'm going to have some basic stuff set up so I can easily grab something. But I'm not going to feel committed to use the things that are set up. And I think that a lot of people, when they say they would never use a template because it inhibits creativity, are saying that because they'll be tempted to use stuff that are already, like instruments, VSTs or whatever, that are already set up. But first of all, I don't think that matters if you have a track set up for, an audio input like a guitar or an electric guitar, and you don't have any, signal processing on the chain already, I don't think that affects the sound at all. It just saves you time. You could easily pop in a microphone and start recording without setting up a new track. And the other thing is with VSTs and stuff, at that point you have to be careful. So, you could set up a piano, a drums, a bass, a synth patch, and then you'll be tempted to use those tones. I think is where you need to be careful. So I think in terms of getting a template, you might want to just set up a template that has audio tracks ready to roll and the option of plugging in a VST instantaneously and signal routing, but not necessarily have specific VSTs. Or if you have VSTs that are specific, like a piano or drums or whatever, then you're going to want to say, do I want this one specifically, or am I just reaching for drums because I'm inspired and I just want to lay down the part first before I even choose the sound. So I think you need to think that through while you're creating it. But I think having the template is very good, generally speaking, for acting upon your inspiration quickly. And I think that is really important. So I guess my main takeaway from having learned from everything is I'm going to continue using templates, but I'm going to be more careful about just pulling up a VST without thinking about it too much. And I will try to avoid go-tos when it comes to that, if that makes sense. So I reached out to some people to give me some topics to talk about also for this Solocast, and I heard back from a couple people, and I'll just quickly touch upon what they said. So Mendy, who was the first guest on the show, wanted me to kind of talk about how to get the right vocal tone for different genres. And he asked me about, what mic you would choose and, how would you effect it. So there's no one right answer to this question. And I don't know if I would choose a specific microphone for a specific genre unless it was like, dynamic versus a condenser microphone, because a dynamic microphone will, or a ribbon, I guess. I don't own a ribbon, but if I did, maybe that would come into the equation as well. But, if I'm doing a beatboxing session, then the only smart microphone to use is a dynamic mic. Or if I'm recording live and there's other instruments being played simultaneously, then I would probably choose a dynamic microphone like the one I'm using now, the RE20, because they're less susceptible to signal bleed, and they just work in those kinds of scenarios. But once I'm using a condenser, I'm using the Slate VMS, the virtual microphone system, so I can obviously choose the microphone after the session is over. But I think, at this point, I'm just throwing up the Slate VMS because I know one of the microphones will work for the person's voice. And I'm not thinking about the genre as much when I'm choosing that microphone as I'm thinking about, how does their voice sound and how does it react to the specific, frequency response and, saturation of that microphone. So I don't think I'm choosing a microphone based on a genre. I guess if you're looking for like an oldies sound, maybe you'd want to get a microphone that has less top end or something. Like if you want to get like a Frank Sinatra kind of sound, then maybe you'd want to use a 47. I don't know. But I'm not usually thinking along those lines when I'm choosing a microphone. However, the way I, affect it will be determined by the genre. And again, not as much the EQ as much as the compression and the ambience. So, EQ, I'm usually just trying to get the vocal to poke through the mix in a nice, pleasing way without too much, mud. And that's usually what I try to get the vocal to sound really very balanced personally. But then the way I compress it will completely be determined on the genre. So, if it's a very natural, open sounding song, like acoustic based, I would probably use a very transparent compressor like the one I'm using here that you're hearing, the FG401, like a VCA compressor that just does the job without affecting it too much in terms of like that compression sound. If I want something that's going to poke through more, like a pop mix, I'll probably use something more like an 1176, that FET compressor sound that has a little bit more aggressive distortion, harmonic distortion in it. And it depends. Sometimes I'll use parallel compression and parallel distortion to get something to poke through. If it's a very dense pop mix, I think parallel compression is probably the best way to go about it. So you can have one signal that's like lightly compressed, one signal that's completely slammed, and then you blend them to taste. So that will definitely be affected. I don't have a lot of experience in the metal world, but I'm sure there's a whole other set of parameters I would use for that kind of genre. I'm sure maybe we got to get some metal people on this show. I'd love to have like a metal interview. I'm hoping that will happen soon. But yeah, so there's a lot of genres, but so the amount of compression I will use will probably be determined on the genre and the amount of instruments inside the track itself and how dense is the track. The more dense it is, the more compression I'm probably going to apply to help it poke through at all spots. In terms of, ambience, yeah, that's also determined by the genre. And if it's like a very minimal, arrangement, it's going to be a lot easier to put a lot of reverb and space and darker reverbs and spaces. If it's very dense, it's going to be much brighter reverbs and delays and less of them, probably. So I guess the biggest genre breakdown in terms of how I think about that is, is it like acousticy, is it folky, or is it more either rock or pop? But again, I guess it's more about the instrumentation and the arrangement than it is about the genre, unless I'm specifically going for like, something to feel like it's in a bar or something, or, or to feel like it's in a, a cathedral kind of vibe. It depends. Maybe it's church music or synagogue music or something, and I want to make it sound like that. So it depends. So I guess that's the best I could give you for that answer. My buddy Max reached out to me and he asked me about recording in less than ideal spaces, and my answer to that is going to definitely be, you're going to want to use a lot of dynamic microphones. Like you see Wolfpack, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the band Wolfpack, they do funk music. And, all you see in those videos are basically ribbons and dynamic microphones, which are just much less susceptible to the room than a condenser microphone. Condenser hears everything. And once you start compressing it, if there's issues in the room, you're going to hear those issues. So when I'm in a room that's not ideal, I'm very often reaching for a dynamic microphone, unless the source signal is like so much louder than the space that, like, I don't know, if I'm recording a piano by itself in a not ideal location, I'll probably use condenser microphones or a drum set. But if I'm doing a vocal or an acoustic guitar even, maybe. Also, it depends how many instruments are being played at the same time.